All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to ASICS seminar series. This is John, the seminar coordinator, and together with me is Kathy Medley, who is our communication specialist. Kathy and I will be the moderator. And today we are excited to have our speaker, Professor Duncanson, joining us from Department of Geographic Science and UMD. Just a few things before we get started. The seminar is being recorded and will be later published on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to ask questions either through chat or you can raise your virtual hand and Kathy will unmute you. Before we get started, let me give a brief introduction about the speaker. So Professor Laura Duncanson is an assistant professor of geographic science at the University of Maryland. And she got her MBAs with others from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, MSc at the University of Victoria, and her PhD from University of Maryland in 2015. Her research is centered on using Lidar remote sensing for biomass mapping, ecological studies, and policy-relevant applications, including forest conservation. She has worked with spaceborne Lidar for over a decade, starting with IceSat glass, and has worked for the past 5 years on algorithm development for GEDI's biomass products. She was a NASA postdoc fellow at NASA Goddard from 2015 to 2017, and many of her projects involve collaborations between the University of Maryland and NASA Goddard. She sits on the science team of NASA's carbon monitoring system, GEDI, ICESat-2, and Arctic boreal vulnerability experiments. And she's a project scientist for the bilateral ESA-NASA multi-mission algorithm and analysis platform being developed for collaborative algorithm development and LiDAR biomass mapping. She is a co-lead of the Committee for Earth Observing Satellites Working Group on Calibration and Validation, Land Product Validation, Biomass Protocol. So let's welcome the speaker, and I will give the floor to the speaker, and Dr. Duncanson, please proceed.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Yep, so yeah, essentially I do a whole bunch of stuff with satellite LiDAR and trees. So today I'm going to be giving you a presentation on global scale forest above ground biomass mapping from space, largely with the wonderful GEDI and ICESat-2 LiDAR systems, and outlining sort of some early results and some new exciting opportunities that these data sets enable, but also existing challenges that we have not been able to overcome just yet. I want to quickly acknowledge, so there are a lot of people who have participated in these activities who are not all listed on the slide, who would be like dozens and dozens of names, but I wanted to particularly highlight those who have helped either lead or produce some of the figures for this presentation. All right, so let's just take a quick step back and remind ourselves why we care about forest biomass at all. So forests are a big part of the global carbon cycle. So here we know very well how much carbon we're pumping into the atmosphere from industry, fossil fuel production, et cetera. And we know quite well how much is in the atmosphere and unfortunately how fast that's growing. So we've got really good measurements of atmospheric growth. We have less confidence or less certainty about how much carbon is being sequestered into both the terrestrial land surface and into the ocean through natural sinks. So on the land surface, essentially it's photosynthesis. So plants are eating carbon as they grow. But then we all have the least certainty about how much carbon is being emitted related to land use change, so deforestation, degradation, forest fires, et cetera. So if you look at the uncertainties of these as a function of like the magnitude of each of the fluxes, the land sink has about a 25% uncertainty, and the land emissions from forest fires, from deforestation, et cetera, a whopping around 60% uncertainty. And so it's like, well, why do we Why do we not know how much carbon is being lost from deforestation, from forest fires, etc.? We can see deforestation from space. We can see forest fires from space. The reason that is so uncertain is because we don't know how much carbon there is to begin with. So we can see that when we lose it, but we don't know how much there was at the beginning. And that's really the sort of critical carbon knowledge gap that missions such as GEDI are designed to overcome. All right, so I'm just going to play a little nerdy promotional video for the GEDI mission. Okay, so May the Forest be with you is kind of our nerdy homage to Star Wars slogan. And as I said, this was a promotional video way back in 2018 before GEDI was launched. So this used to be Coming Soon, the GEDI mission, a co-production from NASA Goddard and the University of Maryland. But now the mission is launched, the data products are flowing, and the Coming Soon part is really Biomass, which I'm going to be focusing on today. All right, so here is we always have to put a launch picture in there. We all went down to Florida to see SpaceX launch up to the International Space Station of GEDI in our nerdy shirts. And here's actually like a sort of better scientific animation of the mission. So GEDI is on the International Space Station. And so here we're zooming into the Japanese Experimental Modules Exposed Facility, which is like a wing off the space station, where GEDI is this sort of box that's plugged into the side. And GEDI has near-infrared lasers, it's a LiDAR system, right, that are shooting down and capturing data along 8 ground tracks across the Earth's surface, a sampling mission. And each one of these laser pulses illuminates about a 25-ish meter diameter circle, and essentially floods the forest or whatever is under that laser pulse with photons that then bounce off the surface and reflect back. So basic principles of LiDAR: you shoot out the laser pulse, it bounces off something and it returns to the sensor, and then the time elapsed between the emission and return of that gives you the distance, because the speed of light's a constant. GEDI will have the first photons per pulse reflect off the tallest thing in the footprint. So in this case, the top of the canopy, and the last photons reflect off the ground. So this orange squiggle here is a waveform. GEDI is a full waveform LiDAR system. And essentially this is like a histogram of reflected photons that tell you the three-dimensional distribution of material in each footprint. So if you get the ground elevation here, which is based on the distance between the emission and the last photons coming back, that gives you the topography, the ground elevation. And the difference between that and the first photons reflected gives you the maximum canopy height in each of those footprints. So this is essentially what GEDI is giving you. It's giving you billions of waveform LiDAR measurements of the Earth system. And so going back to the original, like why do we care about forest biomass? We've never had the right technology in space to make a map of forests in 3D. We've never had it. We've kind of tried to repurpose in the past some ICESat glass data, but it wasn't really fit for purpose. So GEDI is the first ever spaceborne LiDAR designed specifically to study forest structure. It's extremely exciting from like an ecological and remote sensing perspective. So for those of you who are kind of used to, maybe you've used some LiDAR and maybe it's been airborne LiDAR, but you've never used GEDI. You got to think of it as kind of a different thing. So here in this lower left panel with this big nasty red X over it, this is kind of what normal LiDAR looks like, what people are more familiar with, where you see this like incredibly rich 3-dimensional surface where you can pick out individual trees quite easily, right? That's not what GEDI looks like. So GEDI, there's a trade-off here. You can get amazing detail with airborne LiDAR over relatively small areas, but you can't do that everywhere in the world, right? And that's why we do satellite remote sensing. So the GEDI instead, each of these footprints illuminates, as I said, like about a 25-meter diameter circle. And these waveforms represent almost like forest plots, but in 3 dimensions, and they're sampled across the surface. So GEDI, as I said, launched on December 5th, 2018, and its level 1 and 2 products are already online. There's actually a whole year of GEDI data, like the elevation data, the forest height data already online, a lot of data. And by the end of the mission lifetime, we're thinking we're going to have at least 10 billion cloud-free waveform observations of Earth's land surface, which is like orders of magnitude more spaceborne LiDAR data than we've ever had. It's very exciting. Yeah, and then we started science collection back in April of 2019. So this is well underway. And as I said, I think that this is a really important thing, especially for those of you who are more interested or more used to working with raster data, so Landsat, MODIS, etc. GEDI is, as I said, a sampling mission. It's not a wall-to-wall mapper. So GEDI has 3 different LiDAR beams, 3 lasers, and then one of those lasers is split into 2 beams that are about half the power of the original laser, a little bit less, and that's called our coverage laser. So of those 3 lasers, one of them is split into 2, so you have 4 beams coming down, and then those 4 beams are what we call optically dithered back and forth to make these 8 ground tracks. So under the ISS, there's essentially like 8 ground tracks of data being collected, shooting out these laser pulses, and each of them illuminating this 25-meter-ish diameter footprint being like the area on the ground illuminated by the LiDAR pulse. So these footprints, these cookie cutter samples, are spaced about 60 meters along track and 600 meters between tracks. So there's a lot of gap between here that is not actually measured by GEDI. As we continue to collect data as the mission goes along, those will start to fill in, but it's a sample. It's not a wall-to-wall mapper. Okay. So for each of these, we already have essentially a measurement of elevation and of forest height. We can describe that waveform several different ways. But this talk is focused on how we translate those waveforms into estimates of above ground biomass, which is really kind of what we want from a climate mitigation perspective, like how much carbon is there, then we can track how much is being lost to the atmosphere through deforestation and degradation. And we can, start using some cool data for various big science applications. All right, so here's just some early GEDI eye candy. So as I said, the elevation product, the height product, those are already out. So this is looking at a gridded version of those products, and you can see here's this elevation gradient across all of these. You can see the mountains pop out really easily. So this is like zooming out to the whole GEDI domain for topography. So this is like the those last reflected photons per each of those waveforms, but then gridded across the globe. And then similarly for canopy height. So you can see the taller trees are popping up in places like the Pacific Northwest, the Amazon Basin, the Congo, Indonesia, etc., where we know there are tall trees. So it all makes sense so far. But what we're focused on today is biomass. Okay, so those waveforms, it's really a measurement of elevation and a measurement of canopy height. But it's not, you can't measure full tree biomass from LiDAR, nor can you really do that in the field. So what we do is essentially we estimate biomass as a function of some measurable attributes from GEDI. And it's actually very similar to how we estimate biomass in the field, which is going to be a bit of a theme throughout this talk, because if we're worried about those uncertainties, reducing those uncertainties in our carbon estimates and our biomass estimates, those really start in the field where we get our reference data, where we get our training data. So how do we measure biomass in the field? We don't measure it in the field. You can't get a tree to step onto a scale as much as you might coax it. So instead, we measure some measurable attribute in the field. In this case, here's a beautiful big sequoia in Sonoma County. And so we wrap these measuring tapes around, essentially like literally hugging a tree. We wrap measuring tapes around the stems of trees to measure their diameter. And then we can use various approaches to measure the height of trees in the field, and we can record their species, but we don't actually weigh the trees. So to get biomass, how do we even do that, right? So some people have developed, independently of most field campaigns, a set of equations called allometric models that measure measurable attributes like height, diameter, species, and then they actually do cut down the tree they chop it up, they take it to a lab, they dry it out, and they weigh it. So they're actually measuring the biomass in a very small number of studies. So some people have cut down some trees and weighed them and massed them and developed an empirical relationship that says, for this species, a tree of this height with this diameter will have approximately this much biomass. So these are the allometric models. And our entire field of biomass mapping is kind of fundamentally constrained by the accuracy of these models, which we know are kind of problematic in a lot of places. And the uncertainties in these models get larger the bigger the trees. So there's a lot more variability between the mass and the stem girth or the height of a tree, the bigger it is. It's gone through more life history. It's, you know, there's a lot that can affect how big a tree gets, right, over time. So these allometric models, as I said, these are really our constraints, but those are our reference estimates. Those are how we build the GEDI models, are based on these field estimates of biomass, where we've gone in, somebody has gone in, they've measured some trees, they've applied allometric models, and they say, okay, for this individual tree, we think there's this much biomass based on its height, diameter, and species. And then you add up all of the trees in a GEDI size plot. And you're like, okay, this plot has whatever, 200 tons per hectare of biomass or something. And so then you relate that to a GEDI waveform to try and make another essentially allometric model predicting field biomass with GEDI data. So it's different than the elevation and the height. It's really, these are modeled attributes we're getting at with biomass. All right, so that's essentially what we've done for GEDI, is we've scoured the globe and tried to find places where we have field estimates of biomass. Now, we realized pretty early in the mission that we weren't going to be able to do like this big international field campaign of thousands and thousands of plots in the relatively short mission length for GEDI. One, we didn't have the budget. Two, there are some limitations for linking up field data to GEDI data because there's a little geolocation uncertainty in the GEDI data. And three, it's just not enough time to do like a big international field campaign. This was before 2020 hit. So this is like before we knew that we wouldn't be able to do any field work in 2020. We already knew that we were going to be challenged here. So instead, we came up with a way of taking airborne LiDAR and making it look like GEDI. And we talked to our big international community and we said, guys, we're trying to make the GEDI biomass models. Who has field data with airborne LiDAR over it, co-located somewhere in the world? Can we please use your data to train our models? And that's what we've done. So we've borrowed data, begged and borrowed data off the community. Everywhere there's field data. Oops, let me just turn this down. Everywhere there's field data and airborne LiDAR. And we've run the airborne LiDAR into a simulator that makes airborne LiDAR look like GEDI data. So we simulate GEDI waveforms, and then we run those simulated waveforms through the same data streams that real waveforms get run through. So we calculate, the ground elevation of those waveforms, the maximum canopy height, the mean canopy height, canopy cover, etc. And we build these calibration models kind of in advance and then apply them to on-orbit GEDI data. So this is our general approach. This is the map of everywhere we have training data for GEDI models. A lot of this is public data in blue, all these wonderful blue dots. And then a lot of it is private data where we've had to write data sharing agreements. And so this is essentially what we do. Every single one of these has both field data and airborne LiDAR. And we've built up relatively simple empirical models that relate field biomass to field estimated biomass, which is important, to GEDI waveform metrics. Note that this is not perfect, right? There are big geographic data gaps where we don't have any training data. So we don't actually have a way of validating, whether GEDI's biomass estimates are going to be good in Central Asia. It's a big data gap, right? If you do know of anybody who has field and airborne LiDAR data, especially that fills a geographic data gap that you see on this map, please do get in touch because we are always looking to expand this activity. Okay. So then what we do with this database, we then stratify up the world into regions where we feel like there are likely different relationships between biomass and waveforms. And so we stratify it by both plant functional type. Here on the left, this is evergreen broadleaf trees, deciduous broadleaf trees, evergreen needleleaf trees, and a sort of generalized, it's like grass shrub, but it's sort of woodland, low biomass stuff goes in here. This is from a Modis product. So we say like, okay, we'll get PFT from Modis as one way to stratify the world. And then we'll also stratify by continent. So here we have, the continents listed. So we take this database here, and then we build these very simple parametric models predicting biomass as a function of GEDI waveform metrics divided up by continent. So I'm just going to walk you through a very quick example of what that actually looks like. So here we have a real GEDI waveform on the left. This is an actual on-orbit waveform. And we decide where in that waveform the ground is, which is the last peak. So like the last reflected photons above some sort of background noise. So that's here. And then there are ways to describe this quantitatively using what we call relative height metrics, which are the height below which some percentage of the photons in the waveform have been reflected. So in this case, this is the Australia evergreen broadleaf tree model. So dividing the world up, we'd take all the data from Australia that fall into evergreen broadleaf trees, so sort of closed canopy type forests. And we've built an empirical model that predicts biomass. It's a square root transform, but it's biomass as a function of relative height 10 and relative height 98. So we do this in kind of a complicated, exhaustive model fit framework where we take every possible relative height metric and combination of relative height metrics, and we build up like thousands of potential models, and then we test these models based on geographic transferability, which is essentially like a geographic cross-validation. So we take, in Australia, some grid cell would be taken out of the training data and you fit over all the other grid cells. So instead of just normal cross-validation, where you take out, let's say 20% of the data, we take out a whole geographic domain, fit it everywhere else, apply it to that left out domain, and then we repeat that for every single kind of geographic chunk within a fit strata. And so for this one, RH10 and RH98, these made like the best model that was most transferable across that entire geographic domain. Again, Australia, evergreen broadleaf trees. So here we have a waveform, and we have to calculate RH10 and RH98 from this waveform. So the 98th percentile height, which is akin to maximum height. It's the height below which 98% of the waveform's been returned. And RH10, which is kind of the opposite, it's like at the very bottom of the waveform. It's kind of a loose proxy for canopy cover. But yeah, so this is not the official final model. This was one of our preliminary models over Australia. But I just wanted to show you how that shakes out. So we fit RH98, in this case would be 28 meters. RH10 would be -2 meters. Note, RH metrics for GEDI can be negative, and often, especially the lower ones, will be negative because a lot of the energy gets returned in like the lower half of the ground signal. So RH10 is often slightly under the middle of that ground signal. Depends on the waveform, but the more open the canopy, the more likely you're going to occasionally have a negative RH metric. But anyway, so in this case, RH10 is -2, RH98 is 28. You plug them into this model, and you get an estimate for this waveform of 163 tons per hectare. So that's it. It's super simple parametric models. And then we just do this billions of times for every single GEDI waveform, right? So there you go. That's it. That's the whole talk. All right. So then we do that for all the GEDI waveforms. But then, I was talking a lot about ICESat-2. It's like, well, then where does ICESat-2 come into this? Well, if you look at the first 2 weeks, first 2 months of GEDI orbital coverage, you see, oh, wow, like GEDI is really filling in a lot of those gaps. Over time, you're going to get a richer and richer and, better sample of Earth forest structure from GEDI. But the ISS never goes over the poles. So you have this big gap where most of the Earth's boreal forests exist. And those are like massive swaths of forest, a lot of forest happening at those northern latitudes. So it's a really important from carbon accounting perspective, from an ecological perspective. These forests are warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. There's a lot of fire activity. So it's a big gap. What to do? Well, fortunately, there's another satellite LiDAR that is contemporaneous with GEDI. So ICESat-2, another NASA LiDAR, as you might guess, is not designed for forests. It is designed for ice. But it can fill GEDI's northern data gap because it is collecting truly global coverage. So with GEDI and ICESat-2, we have global LiDAR coverage today. I mean, these are both operational missions. They're both in operating mode. ICESat-2 was launched just a few months before GEDI on September 15th of 2018. So really, these are being collected at the same time and are quite useful to use together. Now, from a LiDAR perspective, just like GEDI looks way different than airborne discrete return LiDAR, ICESat-2 looks way different as well, right? So ICESat-2 is what's called a photon counting LiDAR. It's not a waveform LiDAR. So it sends out a laser pulse, and then it only records maybe 1, maybe 2 photons per pulse. So just a tiny, like just 1 or 2 photons per pulse. But then the pulses are crazy rapid. So each of those pulses illuminates about a 12-meter diameter circle, but only records, maybe somewhere between 0 and 2 photons, and then moves only 70 centimeters along track and does the same thing. So it's sending out these super, super rapid pulses of light that are overlapping each consecutive footprint. And we have 3 different tracks here with power beams or strong beams, and 3 different tracks with weak beams that are paired. So essentially you've got these 6 paired tracks. The strong beams, which I'll get into in a second, are really kind of better for forest structure. But yeah, so you have these spaced, just over 3 kilometers between each other, another sampling mission, but a different type of sample. So if you look at ICESat-2 data, essentially what it looks like is like a noisy point cloud of LiDAR that goes on forever as a continuous transect. So you have this going along track here. You can see there are some photons that are being recorded from, atmospheric background noise below and way above the land surface. But you see within that noise, there's a lot of signal along the ground for elevation and also from the canopy. So it's like a continuous noisy point cloud. Then that point cloud gets processed. These are figures from Amy Neuenschwander, who is the lead of the ATL08 product, which is the data product for land elevation and vegetation. So each of these photons gets classified as either a photon that they think reflected off the ground or off the canopy. And here we distinguish between canopy and top of canopy, but essentially vegetation photons, ground photons, and then noise photons that are, there's a lot of green light bouncing around, right? There's a lot of background noise. Okay, so if you zoom in here, you start to see this is really nice signal, particularly for the nighttime data where you have less atmosphere, sort of like solar background noise. But you can see a really awesome topographic signal here, as well as nice vegetation signal, right? So this is like pretty noisy and sparse, but we're getting a nice canopy signal. So we wanted to see, is this data going to be useful for making a biomass map in the North American boreal and then across the entire boreal to essentially fill in the part of the planet that GEDI doesn't sample? So we have 2 current funded research projects through NASA, one through the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment Program, and that's essentially mapping biomass across the North American boreal using ICESat-2. And this is taking the GEDI kind of infrastructure, the statistical infrastructure, all of the way we've learned to do this with GEDI, and applying it to ICESat-2. So we started in the North American boreal. We're in the 2nd year of that project, and now we're expanding it through the ICESat-2 science team to the full boreal. And so we've been comparing the ICESat-2 height data to airborne LiDAR in areas of relevance for the boreal. So this is a figure here showing the airborne LiDAR height versus the ATL08 height, the ICESat-2 height in an area of Finland. And we see that as long as you're not using the weak beam data, it's looking really good. So these heights seem to be quite reliable. So we're using field plot data across the boreal as well as airborne LiDAR to train our ICESat-2 biomass models, and then applying those across the entire domain, essentially from 50 degrees north, so even a little south of the boreal, but so that we can stitch them together with GEDI's products. This will be a little different than GEDI because we're going high resolution with this. So we're linking the ICESat-2 to Landsat data to make a 30-meter map. And we're hoping that the first version of this boreal-wide map will be available, and it'll be like very first version preliminary, but we're hoping sometime in the spring. So this is kind of well underway at this point. All right, and I should say I'm sort of co-leading this with Amy Neuenschwander and Paul Montesano as well at NASA Goddard. Okay, so then the question is, naturally, well, if ICESat-2 is great for height and even biomass, why not combine both GEDI and ICESat-2 together? Even outside of the boreal, right, where you have both of them. So we did some preliminary work in Sonoma County to look at like what would the entire mission data set of GEDI after 2 years look like, and of ICESat-2, and can we combine them together to do better together than we could separately? All right, so here is over Sonoma County. This is what the spatial distribution of those data sets will look like. So this is, we simulated cloud as well, but the black here, these are GEDI tracks. The ISS orbital tracks are kind of these crisscrosses. And then the more north-south tracks are ICESat-2, the blue ones. All right, so that's just the spatial distribution. And you're like, great, way more LiDAR. Some of the GEDI fills ICESat-2 gaps, some of the ICESat-2 fills GEDI gaps. It's a win-win. Why not use these together? So there are very important discrepancies between these data sets. And here are the sort of three main ones. These are not apples to apples data. It's a little misleading though, because if you start working with these data sets, you'll realize that these RH metrics, these relative height metrics, they exist both in the GEDI and in the ICESat-2 data. So you see the GEDI data which I talked about already, right? We use RH metrics to predict biomass. But it includes the part of the waveform from the ground, whereas ICESat-2 classifies photons as either from canopy or ground, and then it calculates percentile heights and calls them relative heights, but percentiles of just the canopy photons. So you can imagine if you're in like a really sparse forest where a lot of the photons are being reflected from the ground for GEDI, and you're comparing RH metrics there, let's say RH 50, the 50th percentile below which, the height below which 50% of the waveform is returned. And then you compare that to ICESat-2, which is looking at the 50th percentile of canopy-only photons. You could see there would be a lot of biases there. So even though they're both called relative height metrics, if you're interested in using both of them, be a little careful here. The second is that there's different canopy penetration. So GEDI is, it's really designed for forests. It's a powerful laser that can get through, up to 99% canopy cover. Whereas ICESat-2 was designed for ice, and it's an awesome data set, but we haven't quite figured out the sort of measurement capabilities in really dense tropical forests. But we do see often that the ICESat-2 won't penetrate all the way to the ground. In like a really closed canopy system, the photons will just sample the canopy and not the ground. So you essentially fit the ground elevation to somewhere within the canopy, you miss the ground. So that's kind of important as well. And then of course, there's different spatial resolutions, right? Each GEDI footprint is about a 25-meter circle. It's actually a little smaller than that. It's, like 22-ish. And then the ATL08 product, I thought that was like a continuous transect. It was like a noisy point cloud that goes forever. The ATL08 product chunks out every 100 meters of that and gives you relative height metrics for it. So it's just like taking 100 meters at a time, and that's what gets output to the product. So it's a different spatial resolution than GEDI. So for the first issue, all else being the same, ICESat-2 height metrics would be biased high compared to GEDI because essentially you just don't have the ground pulling them down. Right. So just the way that they're calculated with and without the ground signal means that except for the maximum height, all of the other height metrics will be shrunk a little bit for GEDI compared to ICESat-2. But in terms of the canopy penetration, if ICESat-2 is missing the very top of the canopy and it's missing the ground because it doesn't quite penetrate to the ground, it's going to be shrinking the trees. So all else equal, the different ability to penetrate the canopy and to sample the top of the canopy as well, right? It'll shrink the trees. So one will bias the GEDI shorter, one will bias the ICESat-2 shorter. I think which is the truth? They're not really apples to apples, right? And then finally, this issue of spatial resolution of 100 meters. This means that if you're just sampling more ground, let's say for maximum height, you're just more likely to capture the tallest tree in the plot, right? 25 meters, like the maximum height of 25 meters compared to the maximum height of 100 meters, you're just going to have a higher likelihood that a taller tree will be in that larger pixel. So that can bias it as well. Okay, so that all being said, it's like, oh no, never use them together. We think that we can correct for a lot of these issues, just not right now in the current products, but for our Arctic or our boreal work, we're looking at, instead of 100 meters, segmenting the transect into 30-meter chunks instead. And this is to facilitate both transferability of GEDI's biomass models, but also fusion with Landsat, which of course is at a 30-meter resolution. So it's not perfect, but you can imagine that 30-meter chunks of ICESat-2 would be more comparable to GEDI than 100-meter chunks. So there's that. Also, we can recalculate the ICESat-2 RH metrics, just adding in the ground photons. Again, not perfect, but it would make the way that those RH metrics are calculated more comparable. So there are ways around this, and we are working on it. Okay, so then what happened in Sonoma was we wanted to say, okay, before we do any of these fixes, before we try and have higher resolution ICESat-2 data, before we try and calculate the height metrics, including the ground signal, et cetera, what does it look like if we just take a GEDI biomass model, so trained with that big global database I showed before, take a GEDI biomass model and slap it onto ICESat-2? I'm like, how well does it do? Let's see. So here's some results from a paper we did this year in RSE, where so this is the power beam for GEDI and ICESat-2, kind of like a good estimate of ICESat-2. These are simulated data sets, okay? Simulated, not real. But with respect to increasing height, canopy cover, and slope, we wanted to see how well do our biomass residuals with respect to an airborne LiDAR biomass map, how well do our biomass estimates do across these environmental gradients. And so we saw for ICESat-2, if you just slap a GEDI model onto it, it actually starts underestimating height pretty significantly, and therefore biomass pretty significantly in particularly tall forests. So I will say also, this is Sonoma County. This is where both of the missions are going to be challenged to their max, right? These are like huge redwood trees, very high biomass. But yeah, ICESat-2 was underestimating in tall forests. And also you see underestimation in dense forests. So up until, about 60% canopy cover, it was doing pretty well, but then it starts to really kind of dip down and underestimate. Interestingly, it was kind of doing okay over slopes. Slopes were not really contributing to a big error here. So this is it was just a first glance to see how we could do. Does pretty reasonably in shorter forests. Slopes are okay, as long as you don't have too much canopy cover, but you do get underestimates in those tall, big, dense forests. Okay. So now I've been focusing this whole talk on GEDI and ICESat-2, right, which are awesome. They're great new missions. They're exciting. But of course, there are a lot of other ways to map biomass, and both GEDI and ICESat-2 are these samples, right? They're these LiDAR samples. So to make a wall-to-wall map, which a lot of users want, we need something to fill in the gaps, right? Be it Landsat, be it MODIS even, but a lot of the most exciting approaches are using SAR data, so radar data, to fill in the gaps. So you essentially calibrate radar data with height and biomass estimates from GEDI and ICESat-2, and then you can make a wall-to-wall map of biomass. And so we think that the best maps are going to come out of not just one data stream, but a combination of many data streams. And so we're quite excited to see this. I'm just doing a time check. Okay. So we think that this is going to be enabling many, many different maps to come out, each with a different strategy for combining these data sets. Just with GEDI ICESat-2 and simulations of the forthcoming NISAR L-band mission alone, we came up with like 7,000 different ways to combine these data sets. So there's a lot there. And what we're actually a little concerned about is almost flooding the market with new biomass maps, right? So if you come out with hundreds of new ways to map biomass, and you're a policymaker and you're like, whoa, I just wanted to know how much carbon there is. Like, I don't need to know much more than that. Then you're kind of overwhelmed, right? So in the sort of last part of the talk is focused on the models being really only as good as the data used to train them and to validate them. So if we have hundreds of maps, we want to make sure that we know how to make sense of the different maps. And so here we have, again, the GEDI training data. And of course, if you have better training data, you're going to have a better product. But if you have publicly available reference data, then if 200 maps come online, we're going to be able to say like which of these maps was the best map, right? As I said, to go back to that fundamental issue of allometry, whatever biomass product you're interested in, you're constrained by the quality of those allometric models, right? And so these traditional estimates are always going to be useful, but I'm really excited about a new technology called terrestrial laser scanning, which is an exciting path forward that measures whole tree woody volume in the field instead of just stem girth and height. So there are ways of taking those training data sets, which we know have huge errors, especially for the biggest trees that have the most carbon in them, and replacing them with terrestrial laser scanning data. So here's just like an image of the instrument we have in our lab that the wonderful Lola Fatayimbo was recently featured in a PBS Nova video, and it also heavily featured our instrument here. But I think that TLS really is one of the main pathways to enrich all of the biomass products moving forward. Actually, I think I'm running a little short on time, so if this doesn't work, this is just showing a TLS point cloud. So you can see this amazing detail, these individual trees. This is all TLS. This is not TLS plus a camera to give it color. But yeah, this is like just data. This isn't a video, okay? It's amazing the kind of detail you can get now with these TLS instruments. Okay. All right, so then just a few slides to conclude about real challenges and opportunities moving forward. So for biomass, we know that no matter how amazing the satellite technology is, the products will be constrained by the quality of their training data, right? So if we can replace or augment existing allometries with terrestrial laser scanning, for example, if we can put TLS in as many plots as possible, and if we can all use as much training data as possible to make our biomass products as high quality as possible, but then also have these data sets be public so that a policymaker can do an independent assessment and say, okay, out of these 200 biomass products, I know which ones are useful for me. So we spent quite a lot of time over the last few years as kind of the biomass community making recommendations for getting in front of this sort of onslaught of future biomass products we're expecting. We think the tap is just going to start opening and then we're all going to be flooded. So to get ahead of that, we wrote this protocol that is sort of good practices for how to make a map, but then importantly, how to compare a map, how to validate a map. This is open for comment right now for the next month. So if anybody's interested in this, please get in touch because we would love to get your thoughts on this protocol document. Okay, so then the last few slides are focused on not making a biomass product, but using a biomass product, which is quite exciting. So this is the brand new project that I'm leading for the new GEDI science team that'll start in January. And we're focused on improving the GEDI biomass product by using some of that terrestrial laser scanning data, especially in the really carbon-rich forests, but then applying it for conservation. So we're working with Conservation International to say, of this biomass, this beautiful biomass map, this is a preliminary copy of that, by the way, put together by John Armstrong at UMD. But of this biomass map, where are all the most carbon dense places and are they protected? Do they overlap with conservation activities? And if they're not protected, can we point to them so that hopefully they can get protected? So what we're doing is mapping carbon hotspots and trying to improve our biomass estimates there. So that's one application toward trying to illuminate where should be protected. But then another project we're working on, this is with funding through NSF, is comparing current protected areas, all the GEDI data in protected areas currently, and places that are ecologically similar but just don't have protection. You're comparing the GEDI data in and without or outside of protected areas and seeing like how effective are protected areas at actually protecting carbon. You know, like if you put in a protected area, will that have a big impact? So this is a sort of preliminary snapshot of that. The image from Amber Liang, one of my PhD students, who's been working on this. And so on average in Brazil, with just over 2,000 protected areas, we saw that in protected areas, the trees were 24% taller, or the GEDI waveforms were 24% taller, and that there was a whopping 53% higher canopy cover. So there's definitely a structural signature here, and we're about to expand this to biomass, which will be quite exciting. All right, so this is my last slide, and it just highlights that although I've been focusing really on GEDI and ICESat-2 and all the cool stuff we are doing and can do with those missions, there's so much on the horizon. So if you're interested in remote sensing of forest structure and biomass, this is like the perfect time to get involved, because not only do we have our beautiful LiDARs here, but there's so much on the horizon, both other LiDARs and also importantly, radar missions. So a lot of stuff happening. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will, I guess, open it up for questions. Here's our Twitter handles for GEDI and myself.
Thank you, Dr. Duncanson, or Professor Duncanson. I received one question like in the middle of your seminar, so I can ask that as people raise their hand, or type questions in the chat. Just as a reminder to raise your hand. If you open the participants panel, there's a little hand icon at the very bottom. It's tiny, but if you click it, then I'll be able to know that you have a question. But the question that I have right now is, from Inseong Jiang, what is the time to visit entire plane coverage?
What is the time to visit entire plane coverage? So the mission was designed to be a 2-year mission nominally. So if the question is when would we be kind of done that first mission coverage, or if it was about for the simulations, that was simulating 2 years for GEDI and also 2 years for ICESat-2. ICESat-2 will certainly last more than 2 years, but we wanted to have a snapshot of all of the data up until 2 years. We're hoping that GEDI is going to end up staying up on the ISS and that ICESat-2 lasts forever. So, so I don't know how much data there will be, but essentially for ICESat-2, it'll stay up there till the lasers fail, and for GEDI, hopefully we can keep that spot on the ISS. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I imagine it was something about the Sonoma simulations.
Great, thank you. There's also a raised hand from Ming Zhang. So Ming Zhang, you are now muted. Hello? Ming Zhang, are you there? She's unmuted. I don't know if maybe her audio is not connected. We can I'll message her in the chat, but I have another chat question.
Okay.
Meanwhile, so also from Inseong Jiang, can seasonal variability of biomass be detected?
That's a really good question. So both yes and no. So for biomass, for our algorithms, they're really designed at estimating stock. And so we're only looking at leaf-on data as inputs to the official GEDI products. Because essentially, like imagine, you have a waveform that describes a leaf-on, like a deciduous tree in the Washington, D.C. area in the summer. It's going to lose all of its leaves. The waveform for the winter is going to have a totally different shape. So the height metrics of that waveform will change, and therefore the biomass estimates would change. That's not related to an actual biomass change of the woody material. It would just affect the waveform. So we train our algorithms just based on waveforms that are like leaf-on waveforms that have the foliage bulk. And then we apply our algorithms only to leaf-on data as well. So our biomass algorithms will only do like kind of stock of kind of peak season biomass. In terms of changes of biomass that actually happen, essentially it'll be like tree growth and mortality or deforestation. So the waveforms themselves will be sensitive to changes like that. But the sort of phenological profile, you should get in touch with some of the developers of the L2B algorithm, which is the sort of foliage profile and canopy cover algorithm, because they're starting to see some really cool phenological signals. But for biomass, we only focus on the leaf-on data.
Cool, thank you. Also, Ning Zhang got back to me. They're having trouble with their mic, but we'll give them a few minutes to work that out. Another question from Yan Yang. Very nice talk. Is the biomass data for Sonoma County grid data, and what spatial resolution is it?
So for Sonoma County, this was a CMS project or NASA Carbon Monitoring System project. And so we had airborne LiDAR there, which was how we made the reference map. So we had field plot data and airborne LiDAR. We made a 30-meter reference map. And then we compared that reference map to the simulated GEDI and ICESat-2 and actually NICER estimates. So that reference map, it's publicly available on the ORNL DAC, so feel free to check it out. But yeah, so all of our estimates were at the individual point level. So we compared it at the nominal spatial resolution of each mission. So we aggregated that reference map to compare the like 100-meter ATLO8 data, and we used it at its 30-meter resolution for comparison to GEDI. So the simulated estimates were at like the mission resolutions for GEDI and ICESat-2, which of course are two different spatial resolutions, but the reference map was originally 30 meters, and then we could aggregate it to different spatial resolutions to compare to each of the simulated satellite estimates.
Great, thank you. Also, Ning Zhang sent me their question via text. So they say, your last slide shows similar color range for Amazon and Northwest US redwood forests, both 250 plus. How do they compare exactly?
That's a good question. You're going to have to stay tuned for the actual like public release of the data. So that was a very preliminary map that we're making, but that's at a 1 kilometer resolution. So our GEDI samples are at the footprint resolution, and that's kind of the product that I was describing today. And then for each 1 kilometer grid cell, to make a wall-to-wall map, we essentially aggregate all of the GEDI shots within each of those grid cells to get an estimate of the mean and the variance of biomass per grid cell. So that was a 1 kilometer resolution product. So you can imagine if you're looking at a 1 kilometer average of biomass, you're going to have, you know, a smaller range of biomass than if you were looking at it at the footprint resolution. So we see like biomass predictions of, you know, 1,000 tons per hectare occasionally at the footprint resolution, but you're never going to see that at the 1 kilometer resolution. So yeah, essentially that map, just for visibility purposes, was everything above 250 was kind of colored the same, but there is quite a lot of variability. But yeah, I'll wait until the early products are out before giving more detail on that.
Thank you. I have one more question in my queue. So any plans on doing data fusion with GEDI and SAR for canopy height retrieval? Yes.
Okay. So quite a lot. I personally, so in that CMS project in Sonoma, we were using UAV SAR, which is an airborne L-band SAR data set, kind of as a proxy for NISAR, which is on the horizon. So the main two kind of exciting SAR missions on the horizon for biomass are NISAR and ICESat Biomass, which is a P-band SAR. But there's also Tandem X, which the PI of GEDI, Ralph Dubaya, and John Armston and others are very actively engaged in working for a GEDI Tandem X fused product. So that they're through the carbon monitoring system again, but they're making I think a pan-tropical GEDI Tandem X fused product that is both height and biomass. So there's been a lot of sort of preliminary work through Ralph's group in particular. A couple of cool papers have come out showing that you can do essentially SAR mapping using GEDI to train an algorithm to estimate height, it's really cool stuff. But yeah, so it allows you to do the sort of wall-to-wall mapping, but it's well trained with GEDI data. So good question, and I think if you want some more detail, feel free to email me about that, and I can connect you with the relevant people who are working more extensively in that field than I am.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Last minute, raising your hands or just text me and I'll unmute you.
Okay. If anyone has any questions afterwards, feel free to just send me an email. Yeah, we're always looking to have more people engaged in this research.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Duncanson. That was a great talk. Yeah, that's all oh my gosh, I don't know how to speak anymore. That's all from us. Make sure to show up next week for our next seminar series. Thanks.
Thank you.